Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I'm Maddie Dalrymple. I write the Ann Kinnear suspense novels and suspense shorts and Lizzie Ballard thrillers. And I also write, speak, consult, and podcast on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the indie author. And you can find out more about me at maddiedalrymple.com and at theindieauthor.com. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask authors 2 questions related to their latest book. What did they learn from their latest book that they'd like to share with their fellow authors? And what did they learn from their latest book that they'd like to share with their fellow readers? And today I am here with Jeff Elkins. Hey, Jeff, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure. So to give our viewers a little bit of background on you, Jeff Elkins is a writer, podcaster, and writing coach. He's the author of 11 novels, including Inside, Outside, and the Nerd series. As the dialogue doctor, he helps writers engage with readers by teaching them to write better dialogue. He has a BA in religion from Baylor University and an MDiv from Truett Seminary, and he lives with his wife and 5 kids north of Baltimore, Maryland. And his latest book is The Dialogue Doctor Will See You Now, How to Write Dialogue and Characters Readers Will Love. And so today I'm asking Jeff the 2 What I Learned questions, starting with, what did you learn from your book that you'd like to share with your fellow authors?
I think what I'd love to share is that imposter syndrome is real and something that you should expect and have a strategy to push through. And that what I learned is that when I was experiencing imposter syndrome, I was actually making an active choice. So let me explain that briefly. The book is about how to write dialogue. And I'll just take one piece of it. In the book, I talk about writing dialogue tags. And I talk about the uses for dialogue tags and how they feed into your work and how they change vocalizations, all that kind of stuff. In order to come up with that knowledge, it wasn't just something that I wrote off the top of my head. I grabbed like 14 master works of like authors that we've respected over time for a long time, new author, like contemporary authors and authors from the past. And I really analyzed in deep ways how they were using dialogue tags in their work. And so I had these hypotheses. I, went through their master works and proved these hypotheses out. And some of the hypotheses didn't make it, but the book is the ones that made it. And so I was confident in my material, but still I wrote the book, finished it in January, and then went to publish it. And it had immediate panic that I was wrong. I didn't have things to say. This is, people are not going to like this. They're going to be upset about it. So I just put it in a drawer and held on to it until May. And it took a long time. And what actually pulled me out of holding on to it was somebody saying, hey, when's that book coming out? I really need it for this thing. And I'm very motivated by helping other people. So that was good for me. And that finding that motivation pulled it out. I realized though, once I published it, that what my giving into imposter syndrome actually was my making an active choice to not risk. So putting art into the world is a risk. It's a risk that people aren't going to like it. It's a risk that people are going to complain. It's a risk that people are going to tell you it's no good. It's a risk that people are going to criticize you. And that, for me, that voice of imposter syndrome that said, like, are you the right person to put this out? Is this real, or are you just making things up? That is really my mind saying, like, is this worth the risk? And that's, I think, understanding that when I was struggling with imposter syndrome, what I'm actually struggling with is the question, is this worth the risk? And so that helped me to say, like, yeah, it's going to help other people. It's worth the risk. And so I ended up putting the book into the world. But for future books, I now know to be prepared for that question to come around.
Well, it's interesting because as the dialogue doctor, you help loads of people with dialogue, among other things. And I'm sure you started that book with the goal of helping people with it. And it's interesting that it took a particular person asking you specifically for the book to remind you that you were doing this for other people. Is that like, could you have reminded yourself sooner in some way?
Probably, but there is something about, and I'm not saying this for everybody, but for me, giving into imposter syndrome feels good. There's a relief to it. There's a like, oh, I don't have to do this because I'm not the person to do it. I think it was somebody calling me back to the original purpose and mission of the work that pushed me to get out of my comfort zone. Because I think that the dark truth is that imposter syndrome was my comfort zone. And so, coming to understand that like imposter syndrome isn't necessarily a disease I've caught, but a choice I'm making because I don't want to risk putting work into the world. It gives it a little bit different tenor, doesn't it? When I put
Yeah.
it that way, when I'm like,
Yeah.
hey, you're giving into imposter syndrome is actively making a choice to keep yourself safe from the criticism. And sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes I'm not you know, criticizing anybody for giving into imposter syndrome. Sometimes you have to for your own mental health. But I didn't, that's not why I was giving it. So my mental health is what it always is. But so that's, yeah, I would say, and for me, somebody asking for the book was clicking my primary motivation. So I am highly motivated by helping other people. I'm very unmotivated by helping myself or by doing things for myself. So for me, that's just what happened to call me back. I think we all need to know our motivation, why we do things, and then manipulate that motivation in order to get the work done. So when we're tempted by imposter syndrome, understanding why you're doing what you're doing is helpful so that you can just kind of like stick your thumb in it and push on it when you
Yeah.
need to move yourself forward.
How about on the reader side? What did you learn from the dialogue, Doctor, We'll See You Now, that you'd like to share with your fellow readers?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the readers for this book are writers, so that it makes it kind of a weird question, but talking more about the content of the book than the actual like production of it. Everything in the book is something. By the time I wrote the book, I had done I had been the dialogue doctor for a little over 2 years, and I had done over 200 one-on-one sessions with authors, helping them empower their dialogue. So everything in the book answered questions about those sessions, answered questions that arose in those sessions. But still, I found as I was writing it, I was discovering unanswered questions. I was like, oh, that's a fascinating question I haven't answered. Personally, one of those questions was, how does character personality align with character growth? It's something we talk about all the time, but I had never actually sat down and had to explain it. Like I always talked about it in the context of other people's work. So it was a great challenge to try to actually put language to that and be like, okay, when I talk about character growth, what am I doing with people? Like, what is it? And I don't know if I know you have, Maddie, but you have those moments where it's like, this is something I do very naturally. Helping writers figure out how their characters are growing is as natural to me as breathing. Like, it's just something that I can do in a conversation. I've done it a ton. I have a set of questions I ask, but actually sitting down and being like, okay, wait, why do I ask those questions? What am I doing when I ask those questions? That those were that was an interesting chapter for me to write, because I really had to pause and ponder and be like, what am I accomplishing when I do this stuff?
It's very interesting because it is today, July 16th, on Tuesday. So 2 days from now, the podcast episode that goes out is going to be Sasha Black talking about The Anatomy of a Bestseller. And she said almost
Great book.
exactly the same thing, in the sense that we talked about the idea of deconstructing work to understand how it works so you can apply it to your own craft.
Mhm.
And she was describing the difficulty of explaining a process that was very intuitive to her,
Mhm.
but explaining it in a way that somebody for whom it was not intuitive could step through it and apply it usefully. So, yeah, almost the same phrasing that the two of you used to describe that.
Yeah, and I know Sasha says this because she said it to me. There is the benefit to you as a writer in writing a nonfiction about what you do when you write something, is that it codifies it for you. It forces you to stop and ask, like, hey, I do this thing well. What am I doing?
Yeah.
Like, why do I do this thing well?
Yeah.
Because we focus a lot on like the things we don't do well, but we rarely focus on like the things that come naturally to us. So I think there's a beauty in figuring out why it is that we do what we do naturally, and then forcing ourselves to describe it for other people, because it forces us to really consider what it is we're doing.
Do you think that that's advice that the readers of your book, who are mainly writers, can apply even if they're not planning on writing a book that they're going to publish? Like, do you recommend that people sit down and write out what they're doing as if they were going to share it with other people in an instructional way?
I think if time was an unlimited resource, I'd say yes, but I don't think there's time for that crap. So no. I think if you want to understand why something in a book worked well, sitting down and doing that kind of journaling exercise would be important. But I also think there's a reality in that, like, hey, we live in a world where you're only as present in algorithms as your last book is. So I would say, like, no, don't go do that just for fun. Go write
Yeah.
the next book. Don't do that for fun. Go
Yeah.
write the next book. If you're not intending to write another book, or, you really do deeply love understanding the craft, I think it's a great exercise. But unless you have a specific reason to do it, I wouldn't say every author needs to go do it, because there's not time. There's not time for that.
Like they're bringing such a nice practical perspective to it.
Yeah, I mean, come on. We got to look out for each other. I could recommend 1,000 things for you to do and just pile more weight for you to carry around all the time. But that's not helpful. We're already carrying enough, right? Like, that's part of what I'm doing with the Dialogue Doctor Will See You Now, is trying to make things easier, not give you more to think about, but give you tools to use that actually decrease what you have to think about. So it's that, yes, we can have wonderful ideas of, sitting in ivory towers and pondering the reason that we did this thing in a book. But let's get real. That's not the world we live in. Let's, get the next book is more important.
Well, I love that. And I can vouch for the fact that the advice you've given on podcast episodes and just talking one-on-one is always very focused on that, the most practical way to get to the craft or writing goal you have. So, Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on what you learned from the Dialogue Doctor Will See You Now. And please let the viewers know where they can go to find out more about you and your book and everything you do online.
Yeah, dialoguedoctor.com. You can find everything there. And the Dialogue Doctor Will See You Now is everywhere ebooks are sold. You can go find it there.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Maddie.